Moderator. I'm Jeff Gedman with the American Interest. I know many of you. I don't know all of you, so great to see you and be with you. I hope one day soon-ish in person. And Craig, I was going to invite our colleague Charles Davidson, our co-founder and publisher, to say a word of welcome. Charles, if you would. It's 15 years anniversary for the American Interest, maybe a word about that. And then you could turn it over to Craig, and then Craig, you would introduce our distinguished speaker and moderate a fabulous conversation. So Paul and Craig, thanks in advance. And Charles, may I turn it over to you?
Sure, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, Jeff. And thank you, Paul. Welcome.
Thank you.
And thank you, Craig, who is a senior fellow at the American Interest. We're very grateful for his association. And thanks, Craig, for making this possible. And there are a lot of new faces today. So welcome, everyone. And we're extremely interested in the subject that Paul is going to be delving into. Thank you again. And Craig, I'll pass it to you.
Okay. Thank you, Charles. It's really great to be asked to moderate this conversation with Paul Stebbins. As most of you know, we'll take questions after Paul's initial presentation. Please use the chat function directed towards me or the hand raised to get in line for questions. Paul Stebbins is a very successful entrepreneur and businessman. Since leaving his position as CEO of World Fuel Services in 2012, he's focused his work on improving the cultural and civic life of America. Today, he will talk about the work of, I'm never quite sure whether it's Fix US or Fix Us, both work, an effort to identify ways of making American political and public institutions more effective and responsive. Thanks to Charles, Jeff, and their team, the American Interest has become one of the best platforms for discussing what ails American politics and American government. In the past month, TAI has had articles and conversations with a range of thinkers and observers on these challenges, including Frank Fukuyama, Phil Zelikow, Jonathan Rauch, and most recently, Abe Shulsky and Shadi Hamid. In his recent contribution to the American Interest, Frank Fukuyama observed that political systems get stuck in situations where they desperately need reform, but are trapped in institutional arrangements that do not permit them to solve their problems. It takes a huge external shock to get people to recognize they have a common problem and that extraordinary measures will be required to get out of it. So Paul, how can we unstick the system? Will the current crisis be enough of a shock to force change? Will the 2020 elections make a difference in your prognosis?
Thank you, Craig. Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Jeff. It's really an honor to be part of this group. As I thought about this, I told Greg I felt a little bit like Chauncey Gardner, showing up at some meeting and, talking about, flowers in the spring. I am not an academic. I'm not a journalist. I don't pretend to be a policy expert, but I am definitely a concerned citizen. I am one of the fortunate American stories. Charles asked me to talk a little bit about that, but I kind of grew up all over the country. I grew up in Connecticut and Texas. I, grew up driving lumber trucks and working in mines and gas stations, and got lucky enough to get into Georgetown, and then got rejected by business school. So I started a business. And the long story of that is, over many years, it became a Fortune 100 company. And I consider it one of the great privileges of my life to have had that opportunity to work with my partner to build a global operation with over 100 offices in 53 countries and see the world and be part of the American dream. I will tell you that that company experiment could never have been possible without America. Without rule of law, without infrastructure, without public education, without all the great things that this country was made of, there never would have been a World Fuel, and there certainly wouldn't have been a successful entrepreneur like Paul Stebbins. So I have deep and profound gratitude for the country and what it gave me. And it was part of that business journey that led me to the Business Roundtable. And as a member of the Business Roundtable, which many of you know is sort of Fortune 100 companies, I got interested in first the national debt issue because one of the members, Dave Cody, who was then the chairman of Honeywell, was on the commission that was called the Fiscal Responsibility Commission that President Obama started with Erskine Bowles and Alan Simpson. And that was an interesting journey for me because I'll be quite honest, the business community wasn't paying any attention whatsoever to these larger national issues. We would come into Washington, we'd be briefed by senators or the White House, whatever was going on, national security advisors, what have you. But we'd all get on our planes and head back out of town. And when Dave became part of the commission, he said, look, this is a real problem. Here we are thinking that we're leaders of this country, but we're actually part of the problem. We're not paying a lot of attention. And if we don't get this issue right, we're going to have real problems down the road. This is the iceberg that could sort of sink the ship of state down the road. So I thought, gosh, geez, these are serious issues. Maybe I should pay more attention. Well, the long and short of it is I got involved at that time and we watched what was then called the Graham Bargain, an effort to solve the great spending tax mix. And I would say to everybody on this call, most will know it completely fell apart. It didn't work. It failed. And that was a revelation to me because it failed for all the wrong reasons. It wasn't about whether we had enough knowledge to solve the problem. It wasn't as if there weren't people who understood the issues that we faced. But we found that it was a much deeper pathology of a system that was just broken. And it was my first observation that you had a system that was rewarded for actually making things not happen. And it was a system that was rewarding, it was more valuable politically to keep an issue alive, to beat the other side to death, than it was to actually solve a problem. And as a relatively pragmatic, non-ideological business person, this was a revelation and kind of a shock. Well, the long and short of it is, having lived through that experience, I became really concerned about kind of the state of our national trajectory. Where were we going if we had such a broken system? So I quit. I went to my board and told them I didn't want to do this anymore. I'd been doing this since I was 25 years old. So much to their shock, they thought I was very sick. They thought I had cancer. But anyway, I told them that I wanted to leave and I wasn't sure what exactly I was going to do, but I decided I would never figure out what I was going to do if I was still running around the world as a corporate executive. So I left. And that's when I met Maya McGinnis. And Maya McGinnis was running the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget. And as part of that relationship, I began to tour the country as a proxy for Erskine Bowles talking about the debt. But what I found very quickly was that as I sat in Rotary clubs and conference rooms in San Antonio and Walla Walla, Washington, and Galena, Illinois, and San Diego, all over this country, I went into rooms where people said, it is unbelievable to us as citizens that we could know as much about this issue as we do, and we can't fix it. Why can't we do that? And what I found is that we were probably talking about the wrong issue. That just to show up and talk about the national debt was one thing, but we had deeper issues going on in the country that spoke to political disconnect between a citizenry who was out there doing their jobs and a political class that was completely disconnected from what they were thinking about. So Maya and I began talking about the idea that maybe there's something more at work here than just the debt. In fact, maybe we'll never fix the debt or any other major issue if you've got a system that is incapable of having conversation, civil discourse. And then, as a business guy, my first instinct was to think it's an engineering problem. So, geez, if we just fixed the primaries, or we just fixed the gerrymandering, or we just fixed money in politics, or something like that, if we just had ranked choice voting, some sort of structural reform, the business instinct was it's an engineering issue. And if we had, more open primaries, we'd send fewer, ideologues to Washington, and maybe we'd get more problem solved. But that wasn't even close. And I can tell you that on my journey, the real aha moment for me was meeting Jonathan Haidt. And Jonathan Haidt had written a book called The Righteous Mind. And it was the first time that I began to understand that there were deeper foundational issues of tribalism that were animating the behavior of citizens that made a lot of sense of what I was hearing out there. So when I would go out there, I got the sense from communities that I was talking to, and it didn't matter. It was nonpartisan. It didn't matter whether they were people in Northern Illinois who hated Obama or whether it was teachers in San Diego who thought he was the second coming. Didn't matter on the partisan spectrum. People were basically saying the institutions are broken. They are failing me. I don't know where I fit in the American story. I feel politically homeless. I feel lost. I feel disregarded. I am not consulted or engaged. I don't know what my future is. I don't know what the future of the country is. I don't know why I have to do my job and why all these people I send to Washington won't do theirs. And I'm just frustrated beyond comprehension. And for the first time, I realized that John Haidt was talking about what it meant when all of a sudden the nature of the political machine was no longer to solve problems. It wasn't about managing variety of interests in order to arrive at a common good. We began to turn it into the cultural wars of values. And all of a sudden it meant that you could demonize your enemy. Your neighbor was now the enemy. The other guy was the enemy. It was the other club that was the problem. And of course, this makes it increasingly difficult to have civil discourse. It makes it increasingly difficult to arrive at something called truth. It makes it increasingly difficult to know where you fit. So the second thing that was a revelation to me was Tim Dixon and Matthew Lefebvre and Dan Vallone had done some work called a Hidden Tribes Report. It's part of an organization called More in Common. And again, they had actually done the work that gave some research and validation to the things that I was seeing in person. I just didn't know how to measure it. And he basically said that the self, if you will, the spectrum of political identification was being largely controlled by extremes, about 8% on the left in what they call progressive activists, and about 6% on the right called committed conservatives that were holding the entire system hostage. They had the megaphone, they had the money, they had a very non-pluralistic view of politics, they were very doctrinaire, and it was the kind of orthodoxy, investment in orthodoxy that John Haidt was talking about. But in between those two extremes was an exhausted majority. And that's what I had been seeing. I saw citizens who were exhausted by the political fighting. They didn't understand why we couldn't solve problems they have to do in their life. They have to compromise with their bosses, with the person to make the coffee in the morning, with suppliers, with customers, with their spouse to take out the garbage, with their teenage kids to clean their room. They compromise every day, but Washington was filled with ideologues. And as Mickey Edwards taught me, certainty is the enemy of deliberation. So if everybody is walking around in an orthodoxy and won't move off the reservation, then the whole system grinds to a halt. So that revelation said, geez, okay, well, if that's the case, what the hell do we do about that? Because this is a road to nowhere. We will find ourselves in very difficult shape and the country won't be able to solve anything. And God forbid if we ever have a massive crisis, which of course we're living in now, we will find that the stress fractures, these things underneath the system that have been broken for a long time, will really reveal themselves. So to Craig's question, what do I think about the upcoming election? This was going on long before the current occupant of the White House. It's going to go on quite a bit longer, regardless of who wins the election. These are deep root cause problems that transcend any one political figure. And I would say that most politicians are reflective of what's going on in the country. And I think that I realized that it was sort of unusual. The left would, of course, say that, that the current president is the worst thing that's ever happened to the planet Earth. But, as Yascha Mounk has often said, you've got a hyper-urban, hyper-educated elite that doesn't know anything about what 50% of the country is thinking. And that doesn't help our political conversation. And of course, you've got people on the right who are equally doctrinaire. So Fix Us grew out of an instinct that said, look, we forget about the debt. The debt is not, the debt is a very important issue, and Maya's group works really hard on that, but we'll never solve that or any other big issue if we don't begin to think about how do we restore trust in our society, in each other, in our institutions, which are failing. And you go on down the list. Business blew up the world in 2008 and 2009, and nobody went to jail. The government can't get anything passed in Congress. The approval rating of Congress is at 8%. The Justice Department is not working. Kids are getting shot in the streets. The education system is failing. We're no longer competitive in the world. Go on down the list. Jonathan Rauch has done a lot of work on this. The pathology which you can measure of a broken system. And Frank's talked about this, Frank Rupiano. So what we decided was, well, maybe we should start thinking about the problem beyond our own bubble. And, I'm a big believer. Hubert Humphrey once said that, Washington is 26 square miles surrounded by reality. So maybe if we spent more time listening to reality and going out there and exploring the country, we would find out a little bit of what we might do to help fix it. So Fix Us was founded, and it was founded with the idea that people don't really hate each other. They don't hate their neighbor. They don't hate that they do want to solve problems, that there's much more that unites us as a country. I'm a great optimist on this. I have tremendous belief in it, that there's more that unites us than divides us. And that if we made our mission to build community Americans that were really committed to solving problems and give them some sense of agency in a system that they feel has abandoned them, you could build a new kind of political engagement that transcended the party apparatus, which is clearly broken and self-interested. That, you know, as Mickey has often taught us, you know, George Washington never contemplated parties. It wasn't about one club against the other club or one team against the other team. It was one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all, right? So how do we restore a sense of agency for citizens who are frustrated? How do you begin to engage and diversify the way we think about political engagement? And that we wouldn't be doing this as a commission from the top down sitting in Washington, D.C. It would be done in collaboration with a community out there that is dying for change. That is one thing I learned. There is a very motivated group of citizens out there who would love to be part of the solution, and they have been left out of it. So we started the process of starting Fix Us. It took the form of first trying to look at the root causes. What are the political dynamics, the economic inequality, mobility, urban-rural divide, the cultural issues around demographic change, community and shared values, media and technology. What has social media done to us? And what would we do to, you know, is that helping the cause or is it hurting the cause? And how does it drive us apart or pull us together? And then ultimately the failure of elites. What is it that we've done where we've missed the boat and kind of left a whole generation of people behind wondering what happened to leadership in this country? So we all own it. I was part of the problem. You know, the business guys were there talking about debt. All they wanted to talk about was tax reform, but they weren't paying much attention to all the other issues that were going on. So, you know, we all own part of this issue. And so I'm a big believer that we all have a role to play in changing it. So there is no Wizard of Oz. You know, there's no man behind the curtain. There's no Mitch McConnell, Donald Trump, or Barack Obama, or Nancy Pelosi is going to solve all our problems. I think the heart, the brain, and the courage of this great nation is within each of us, and that we all have a duty of care to restore some sense of humility and some grace and some humor back into our public discourse. And I don't mean it in kumbaya. This isn't that we all have to agree and be friends. We can have rabid disagreements, but we can do it in a way that is ultimately in service of our national project. You know, the American experiment is an extraordinary thing in history. I think it's at risk, and I think we all take ownership in trying to preserve and protect it. This is a group on this call that all has the ability to influence, and I hope that we'll all be part of that. So with that, Craig, as introduction, maybe we can go from there.
Okay, so who would like to ask the first question?
Beating them.
Okay, let me start then. I think your analysis of the problem is terrific. Where do we start on the solution?
Right, exactly. So we took an approach where we said, look, let's kind of break this down into pieces. One would be, what are these root causes, and does the broader public who is sort of feeling them actually understand what is going on at the deeper kind of root cause level? So there was an effort to do some research. We're in the middle of compiling a paper, and this actually would be one of the asks I'd have for everybody on this call. We compiled a paper that began to analyze the political dynamics. So what happened in the party system, what happened in the electoral process, what's happened with money, lobbying, the use of power, what's happened in the economic world in terms of inequality and mobility. What does that mean? Culturally, what are we doing about demographic changes, community education, civic education? What are we doing on media and technology? How is that impacting life? And the failure of elites. We began to break that down into these buckets, thinking if we could get to the root causes of what's driving our division, our dysfunction, and the lack of trust, then maybe we would begin to build a road back from that. Now, again, we come at this with a great deal of humility. It's not like Paul Stebbins or Maya McGinnis or Mike Murphy or our project have any divine knowledge of what the ultimate answer is. I mean, it's a really complex, interrelated bunch of issues. So we come at this with a lot of humility and knowing that we don't have the answer. But the first thing was, why don't we just begin to break down the process? So that was one component of what we began to do. The second is, why don't we do a roadshow where we would go out and visit parts of the country? So we spent the last year and a half visiting with communities in 30 states around the United States. And these were everything from trade organizations to local community groups to civic organizations, and listened to what people were concerned about. And some of the things that I, recounted in my introduction were what we heard. So the idea was, let's take note of all that and begin to inventory the kinds of things and where were the commonalities. And then let's partner with the people who have expertise around this, people like More in Common and Ipsos, who know a lot about how to do sort of deliberative polling and get closer to what's driving the underlying angst in this political divide. We would do that. The third thing was we would have to build sort of how do you begin to build the bridge between the elites and citizens? So part of it was to engage people like the people on this call to think about how do we take the thinking that's going on that we've learned a lot about and begin to draw a more bold and dotted line back into citizens so that they could actually begin to say, gosh, there's a reason I feel this way. And the elites actually are not just some remote thing, but they're actually something that I can talk to directly and be part of. So that was another component. And so we're in the process of building out sort of a citizens, steering committee that would be a combination of folks out there and folks from our inner sort of beltway circle and elite circle to have conversations about how we do this. And then the last piece was, how do you really build, how do you create agency, political action agency and policy development around all of the different things that need fixing? And it's not just, okay, so there are people that are working on the structural stuff. There are people working on gerrymandering, and there are people working on open primaries, and go on down the list. There are 100 groups that are active in the civic reform space, but they don't have a lot of coordination. They haven't actually had a lot of encounter with each other. And so we are part of the software that's beginning to link best practices, cross-fertilize. Again, we don't have a particular dog in the hunt. We think that all of these efforts are productive, and we don't know ultimately what will be the solutions. But it starts with someone's got to help facilitate that activity. And we have evidence from like the work that Larry Diamond did with Jim Fishkin, Americans in One Room, that if you get people of very different political views in the same room, and I'm talking hardcore MAGA versus the most, aggressive progressive activists, and you get them in the room to actually talk about a problem for more than 5 minutes, the minute you get past the immediate knee-jerk demonization of the other side, it's amazing how much people have in common and how much desire they have to solve problems. So I'm a big believer in, there's a guy at Harvard, Roderick, who's talked a lot about lean globalization. And he talks a lot about how do you push decision-making further back into community level. So we're working with state organizations. We're very interested in groups like this to help us make contacts at the, if you will, sort of the thought leader level at states to help us, make connections so that citizens at a state level can take more control. So there's a bunch of different components to it, Craig, but it starts with that kind of a backdrop.
Okay, we're going to start with Damir, and then I have a question from a concerned citizen.
Paul, thank you so much. This is really terrific. Can I ask you, you gestured at this in your opening remarks that, should a crisis befall us, should a big crisis befall us, what a situation would be in. Can you talk a little bit about now, now that it's upon us in a lot of ways, a lot of the sort of divisions and the pathologies that are manifesting now, how much of it, how do I ask this exactly right? How much of this do you understand through what you had seen before and all the research you had done before, and how much of it has changed and is altering your approach to going forward? Has anything changed, or is the approach more or less the same?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you very much, Damir. I would say, let me sort of get at the second part first. What's changed about my view of what will happen is, as you know, one of the conversations that's been the TIA has hosted and others as well has been, is this going to rip us apart, or is it going to draw us together? I am finding myself more and more in the camp that this will in fact unite us in common cause. Now that may not be so evident at this moment, but we are paying a huge and very dear price. And Frank Fukuyama's made this point, others have made this point, that we are being hit with just an existential shock of enormous magnitude. And I don't think we have fully grasped just how profound an impact this is going to be on millions and millions of lives. But if I am part of the millions and millions of lives impacted, I want to know, how on earth could this sort of happen? My entire world could get blown to smithereens in sort of, weeks, right? And the whole nation stops, and we've got, we're, well on our way into a depression, and you've got businesses shutting down, and people don't understand. And what happens is, so here's, now back up a step. So the things that I was thinking before was that we have lost our capacity for civil discourse. We don't have reasoned, sort of, if you will, to solve a problem type approach. It becomes more valuable to have the partisan warfare, and everything is filtered through an orthodoxy. And if you're off the orthodoxy, you are an enemy of the state, or you're certainly an enemy of my tribe. And that, is one thing when we're all sort of going down the road and doing okay. But when you begin to filter a crisis of this magnitude through that kind of a prism, it has enormous damaging impact, right? Because you've got one narrative that says, oh, it's just a hoax. The whole thing's a bunch of nonsense. Or on the other side, you get this sort of maximalist view, and I think this came up in the Jonathan Rauch conversation the other day with you guys. There's sort of a maximalist view that says, we will not lose one life to COVID, no matter what. Well, okay, my dad was a geologist. In theoretical physics, it takes infinite energy to get to absolute zero. And in public policy, it costs infinite dollars to get zero risk. There's no such thing. You can't legislate zero risk out of society. But we live in this sort of maximalist view that everything is, an ideological certitude. And if you venture out of that, or you get pragmatic, somehow you're betraying the values of the cause, which I think is inane, and I think is incredibly dangerous to our system. So we have a situation where these highly illiberal impulses, in which we diminish conversation, have hijacked the system. And who's paying the consequence of that? Citizens who are not invited to that debate in the first place. They don't know the first damn thing about it. So all of a sudden they're paying a price for a bunch of nonsense that they wonder what the hell happened. And that, I think, is criminal. I think we all own that. And I think as the elites, this is an incredible failure. And it's not just, oh, it's all Donald Trump's fault, it's all Nancy Pelosi. It's not, this blame game is part of the pathology. But what I would say is we are so geared to filtering the discourse around complex issues as being this ideological prism, that it makes it impossible to get to anything that resembles truth, or have anything that resembles a youthful conversation or the exercise of common sense. So if you don't have infinite dollars to get to zero risk, well, then you figure out what you're going to do. I mean, airplanes crash. We fly in them. They just don't crash very often, right? So COVID is somewhere on the spectrum. I mean, I'm a Georgetown guy. I went to ethics class. I mean, Aquinas, just war theory. I mean, we've been talking about this, but we don't teach it. We don't have any sense of balance. And so instantly, the sound machine of the orthodoxy takes over. And what happened to the common sense of the problem solving? So we diminish expertise, we diminish science, we filter everything through our favorite prism, and then we get trapped in a box where if, oh, no life can die because of this. Well, okay, everybody's trapped in an ideological box. And meanwhile, who's paying the price? And what happens on the left, those crazy people with AK-47s in Michigan, well, they're not all crazy, white supremacists. Some of them are people who are just desperate because they're going to be out of a job. And we don't have a good answer for them. They don't know how it happened, and they're not sure where it went wrong. And sure, in the beginning, Americans responded quite well. We don't know what this is. We don't have masks. This thing is coming. We better lock down. We better be safe. But boy, when then all they see is just this continuing skirmishing with no united effort to solve a problem, I think we all own that on both sides, and there are no innocents. So it frustrates me, and I think you've got a very authentic and legitimate anger and rage in our citizens that just wonder, if one of the measures of governance is competence, how could we be this incompetent to respond to something where, America used to be the pragmatic can-do society that got things done with not a lot of ideological nonsense. Well, I don't think we're doing very well. And that's a sad, sad state of affairs for our political experiment. So back to Frank's point, the system is stuck. And shame on all of us. So, I would gladly turn the whole problem over to a room full of people run by Larry Diamond and Jim Fishkin and find out what they came up with in 3 days. I bet you'd be pretty good. Back when Maya was doing the debt stuff, she ran a thing on Social Security. And if you gave them 100 different citizens, just random citizens across the political spectrum, 100 different ways to solve a problem, there was 92% convergence across a broad political spectrum. But if you put an R or a D in front of any of the line items, the convergence drops to 30%. What does that tell you? It's all about the tribal stuff. So I would just say this is just writ large, and we are paying an enormous price, and it's a terrible shame.
Okay, Paul, we got a lot of people back up now.
Sorry.
For questions. Let's start with Charles Davidson, and then we'll go to Mike Sweeney.
Great. Well, Paul, this is terrific. And we love hearing you mention Larry Diamond favorably, who's one of our contributing editors, writes for us regularly and part of our intellectual inner circle. But my question was about political parties, because I think I agree with you. We agree with you. Things are a mess. People aren't represented. Is this a time to really completely shake up one of the parties or even create a third party? I mean, your effort sounds a little bit like a third party effort almost in a way.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question I get asked a lot, Charles. And to say that I actually knew the answer to that, I don't know. Because the way I come at it is that, this is sort of, if you think back on like Federalist 10. So, Federalist 10 says different leaders ambitiously contending for preeminence and power divided mankind into parties, inflamed them with mutual animosity, and rendered them much more disposed to vex and oppress each other than to cooperate for their common good. So I find myself thinking a lot about Federalist 10 right now, that the purpose of the parties has been more intent on dividing us and vexing each other than it has been for the common good. So there's a lot, I'm of two minds. On the one hand, we've heard John Roush speak very eloquently about what is it that we need to do in terms of stewardship of these structures, to vet people, to bring professionalism into political parties, to make them have a responsible role. And I think he makes a very eloquent case for that. But I must confess, I've become much more in sort of the Mickey Edwards camp, which is, I don't think we ever intended to have parties in the first place, and maybe we ought to get rid of the damn things. Now, what will actually happen, I don't know. Fix Us did not start as like, we're not the modern day Whigs or some political party, but the idea was you better start with the idea. Because if you're going to start any sort of a movement and get people all wound up to go do something, what are you anchored in? I remember back when Bob Dylan and George Harrison, there's a very famous story about Bob Dylan and George Harrison talking about a song. George Harrison plays Bob Dylan the song. He says, that's a really great song, but what's it about? And so Fix Us was, why don't we spend more time not getting buried in the partisan war? I know a lot about that. Let's try to transcend that and get more deeper into this hidden tribes, John Roush, understanding of what's driving the human beings in our country. Let's talk more about, that the culture, that the currency of culture is trust. And, Yo-Yo Ma has said that many times, that if money is the currency of the economy and power is the economy, the currency of politics, then maybe the currency of culture is trust. So how do we restore trust? We wanted to get out of the partisan thing. Now, if there's ever going to be any sort of a third party or no party or whatever, it still has to be anchored in something. There has to be some sense of shared identity or common cause. So our primary goal was not to get down the rabbit hole of the partisan warfare, but to actually go directly to citizens and engage them as part of a conversation. Because people would say, well, who's the leader who's going to take us out of all this? I think we got a lot to learn from many, many, many different parts of our country. They just haven't been asked. And so I'm in the business of finding out what are our root cause. Let's do the homework. Let's actually get it analyzed. And how that manifests itself ultimately in political movement or action is yet to be determined. I don't presume to know the answer to that. It's not for me to say. But maybe that's where it ends up, but that's not what we set out to do. Fix Us was not founded on the idea that we needed yet another party or we had to get rid of one of the parties or both of the parties. It was founded on the idea that our citizens are a community and they have been left out. And we want to support them. So.
Mike Sweeney, and then we'll go to David Kramer.
So Paul, do you see any political leaders that would join us in a movement like this? Or is it simply our militia saying throw all 535 members of Congress out on the street in a throw the bums out movement?
Yeah, it's a great question, Mike. So I would say that one of the things we learned when we went out and talked to citizens, they'd say, we threw the bums out and then new bums came in and they're doing the same thing. And that's because the system's broken. So you find out that first of all, you got a primary system that is, down to sort of 12 competitive districts in the country. So we've gerrymandered everything. So all you got to do is get through the primaries, and 5 or 6 or 7% of eligible voters who are the true believers show up in primaries. They send ideologues to a safe district in an uncontested general election. Then they come to Congress as true believers, and they can't get anything compromised. And they've got the same people sitting in their reception area that were there the last time with all the money to tell them how to vote. Well, okay, so even if we threw the bums out, the problems are still going to be there. What I would argue is that what kinds of questions are we hacking? I would say I actually have a little bit of sympathy for many of the political people, because they'll tell you in private, they know how broken this is. They know it's not working. You can't run everything through leadership's office. You cannot have Ted Cruz running an insurgency in the House and the Freedom Caucus and hold everything, grind everything to a halt. Everybody kind of knows that. You can't have everything run through the appropriations and 4 people sit in Mitch McConnell's room and deliver a bill to the floor. But that's sort of the inside baseball. The problem is, even if you throw all the bums out, all the inside baseball problems still there. So you've got to do the hard work, sort of building the Japanese sword, heat, fold, hammer 1,000 times. You got to fix the reform issues. You got to fix the committee system. Some of the reforms that we did, and Jonathan Rauch has written well on this, but a lot of the reforms had unintended negative consequences. So yeah, get rid of earmarks because it's supposedly bad. Well, that was the lubrication of how you actually got deals done that solve problems for people. Or you start televising subcommittees, and now everything ends up on a YouTube clip in a campaign. I mean, it's just terrible. So, new generation of leadership, you've got groups like the Millennial Action Project that are cross-partisan. They're trying to build discourse where people are saying the old party orthodoxy doesn't work. We've got to break out of that box. So there's some positive things going on, but I don't see any one leader, certainly, that stands up and says, geez, I'm the vanguard of a movement. I think the movement is many, 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 many points of light.
Okay, David Kramer, and then we'll go to MJ after that.
Thanks very much, Craig. And Paul, thanks very much for this presentation. I really found it inspiring at a time when we could all use a little inspiration these days. I'm down here in Miami at Florida International University. I'm curious whether you have engaged in any outreach to college and university campuses, because it seems to me my students, for example, would greatly benefit from hearing your presentation. I worry that they are getting jaded with everything they're seeing. We encourage public service in our students, but I do worry about the impact that all the politics we're seeing will have on their outlook. Thanks.
It's a great question. I'm so glad you asked. First of all, we're neighbors, and I have spoken at FIU on occasion. I live in Coconut Grove, so I know your area well, and I actually have spoken at the business school. Jackman Joyce was running it. In any event, I would be delighted to do that. Every time I do a meeting around the country, I always ask specifically if there is some sort of a school that I can also go speak at, because I specifically asked for undergraduates as well as because the graduate students in some ways are self-selective. They've got a disposition that's more advanced, but the undergrads are the ones who you don't know whether they're going to just lean back in their chair and check out, or whether they're going to throw tomato. I just love the surprise of it, right? And I figured that if you cannot communicate with that group, and remember, I'm the 63-year-old white corporate guy, and what's funny is that, half of them want to be me, and the other half hate my guts. They're not sure why, right? So I'm like the perfect foil. But I really enjoy engaging them. And I had a professor at Georgetown who once said, I asked him why he taught. He said, 3%. I don't need everybody, but 3% the light goes on and never goes off. So the reason I do those undergrad classes every chance I get is to look for the 3% where a light goes on and says, wow, never thought about that way. And it's going to be hard to put that worm back in the, right? So I think you're absolutely right. I think I always tell the young kids, I said, Twitter, man, you guys took down a government in Egypt and you're not even asked at the table. You're not even part of this conversation. And, and we haven't taught civics, so they're not stakeholders in what we all grew up with, separation of powers, and these are important things, and democracy is good. They're saying, look, right now, democracy is not solving climate change. It's not solving a lot of things. So you guys are incompetent. Like, why should I support that? And either that, or they get trapped into sort of the, John Haidt's coddling of the American mind, where they're under such an incredibly rigid progressive orthodoxy that they don't even embrace any diversity of ideas. And so that does a huge disservice to our next generation, and that is going on campus right now, that is then going to make its way through our system in business and in government and all sorts of other roles. So man, I would love to engage the youth movement. I think they have far more power than they think. You talk about Dorothy click your heels, there's no Wizard of Oz. I would love to engage them. And it's not just millennials. I'd like to get Gen Z too. And the one thing I'm hoping, you know, if you read John Haidt, you get very nervous about Gen Z. Coddled, checked out, you know, all entitled, never had a hard confrontation in their life. But boy, did that change in the last couple of months, right? So maybe actually there are hope. Maybe that's our next opportunity. Maybe this is their uncoddled moment where they say, wow, the system really did fail me and I need to engage. Anyway, I'll go to any campus anywhere in this country. I think it's really important.
Next, MJ and then Richard Kramer.
Hi, thank you for speaking with us today. I'm currently in Michigan, so I definitely wanted to kind of touch on some of the things that I've been experiencing in my state, at least.
Sure.
But one thing that I think a lot of us have been seeing are state governments that are sort of capitulating to the loudest crowd or the most extreme constituents because they're the ones willing to be protesting in front of the state capitals, whereas a lot of moderates or just people who are very worried about the situation are quiet and staying at home. And you kind of talked a little bit about these people, the ones who are concerned, who do want to do something, but in the current environment don't really know where to find their voice.
Sure.
And so on one end, you have the people literally screaming, give me liberty or give me death with coronavirus. But then on the other hand, you have people saying, I'll literally do anything to avoid death. And so I wanted to know, with your initiative, how do you plan to give a broader voice to the citizens who aren't the ones at the Capitol screaming?
Yeah.
And do you plan to use the current system to address their concerns?
Boy, I thank you so much for asking that question. You are right at sort of ground zero of the issue. So you are witness to what happens when the most illiberal impulses of maximalist orthodoxy hijack the conversation and are aided and embedded by a media revenue model that is rewarded for perpetuating that. And everybody else that exhausted in between, that 70% in between that is watching all this and saying, you know, I just lost a job. I'm not sure why. I don't, you know, it's not about burn it to the ground. I just want to get back to work and I want to be safe. I don't want my family sick. You know, we so diminish our capacity for conversation. And I think that that is awful. So there are, you know, this is where I do find myself, you know, getting a little bit towards the blame game. You know, the elites and media play a role in this. We do have the power to change that conversation. We have the ability to change it in the way we frame it as intellectuals and people who write about this. We have, because we're all very good at writing about, you know, we've seen the enemy on either side and we write about that, but we don't write about the quiet, lost, anonymous American who's in the middle of all this scandal and, you know, is being asked to pick a side in a fight they don't even understand. So it's a false choice. And the media is beaming at them, you know, some terrible person with an AK-47 and that is, my God, they're coming, it's gonna burn America to the ground. I don't think that's an accurate portrayal of most people's lives. And the extremists who are typically the rich and, you know, well-protected elite who are worried about that one life, well, okay, I mean, it's easy for them to talk about, but they don't have a clue about what most people's lives are about. So you're right, you have just identified what I think is part of what drove the whole Fix Us idea is let's take back that conversation. And we have the power to do that. You don't need permission. You don't need to pass a law to do it. You can do it in your community. You can do it tomorrow. You could lead our next chapter in Michigan, right? And you can do it and you can run it. And there's absolutely nothing in your way. In the meantime, I'd like to see those kinds of local chapter movements where we start creating cover for local politicians who are taking that heat and making it easier for them to do the right thing and come to common cause. We make it easier on governors who have to balance budgets and run real lives. They're not living in this federal, you know, fishbowl back in Washington at the federal level. And ultimately, I'd like to get the elites on this phone call to do more to actually make that case. You know, be out there and saying, whoa, 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 can we just stop with the noise? Let's disempower these people that are creating it. But you are right at the heart of it. I couldn't thank you enough for that. That's what started our whole organization.
So Richard Kramer, then we'll go to Martin and then Catherine, and we'll probably finish up with Jonathan Rausch.
Paul, thank you very much for this. About a year ago, I started my own, well, co-founded rather, my own organization that also seeks to get outside of the Beltway to talk to Americans about vital issues. So, you know, kindred spirit of sorts, and your enthusiasm is infectious. I want to go back a little bit to the talk about generations, and whether it's millennial or Gen X or baby boomers. And I'm recalling, I think it's Morley Winograd at Brookings about a year ago had posted a very interesting blog talking about baby boomers and gridlock. Boomers are of a generational archetype labeled idealist by generational analysis. This type of generation is often indulged by their parents and encouraged to develop strongly held personal values. As a result, members of idealist generations uncompromisingly adhere to their deeply held principles in all their lives. This pattern produces a challenge, which we've been seeing right now.
Yep.
So framing it like that, you and your colleagues have gotten out to 30 states, you talk to Americans. I'd be interested if in your own experience or if in research that you're using, some of the optimism that you have or the messaging that you give, does it vary whether it's a Gen Xer or whether it's a baby boomer or a millennial? Because we do see that there are certain generations do have certain characteristics that could actually be feeding the very problems that you're trying to solve. Thank you.
Yeah, no, 100%. Thank you for that. That's a great question. And yes, it's true. We do see various, and you are definitely, you're sort of echoing the John Haidt, my God, we've got a generation that's just, ever since the kid on a milk carton, got kidnapped, we've been hovering and helicoptering and preventing kids from having any kind of a real confrontation with either ideas or life. And the academy, to a large extent, had been sort of hijacked by that. And so therefore, there's diversity of everything except ideas. And so what that means is these are fragile young people. They're not tempered by the real debate. Look, the Enlightenment tradition was critical thinking. You celebrated the debate. I welcome the challenge to our ideas. Part of why Fix Us is even doing this call is we're hoping people will challenge us, push us, and make it a better effort, right? It's not fragile in the sense that you're talking about with this youth. So when I engage the communities, you do see some generational things. Great generation people, oh man, what happened to my country and how soon can we get it back and how can I march? I would say millennials are interesting to me because I met with one who I will not use his name on this call, but he's a really interesting young guy. I met him at 26 years old and he showed up with he started a little organization, but he showed up with a swag, like a gift for me. And it was a coffee mug quoting James Madison. And he said completely deadpan to me, no irony in his voice whatsoever. He said, we watch what the adults have done to our country with the national debt and all these issues, and we think it's really broken, and gosh, it's terrible, but I think we're going to have to be the adults. And I wanted to hug the guy. I thought, isn't that amazing? So here was this millennial kid who just said, gosh, maybe we're going to have to be the grown-ups to fix this thing. I would love to see them get engaged and fix it. So I've seen some of the most hostile of the orthodoxy of the progressive left come at me. You're the white entitled 63-year-old male oppressive guy, and it was part of your stupid system, which has been corrupt since day one. And, it was bad back in the beginning and it's still bad now. And the whole thing is evil. I've heard that, and I've had to sort of say, well, yeah, but let's talk about that. The thing is, they're not used to talking about that. They're used to having that just accepted as orthodoxy, right? And so I've confronted that on both sides. And at the end of the day, I don't think it's so much about winning everybody, right? But back to Mickey, if certitude, look, the Jesuits talk about beware of cheap clarity, right? If it's on a bumper sticker, it's probably not true, and that building deep faith, or in this case, civic faith. Deep civic faith is about humility and doubt. It's not about certainty. So if I have one goal with that youth that you're talking about, particularly that demographic, is to create just a moment of doubt, just a little bit of humility. And interestingly enough, I'm surprised at how well they do engage if you can get them past the war, look, like Hortense Kalischer said years ago in New York, some people inhabit a revolution but never know what it's about. And I don't think we can be morally reckless or careless with revolution. It's serious stuff. So if you're going to burn it to the ground, the moral right to revolution, according to Aquinas, was you better rebuild. So what are you tearing down? Great, you tore it down. Now what? Felt great. What are you going to build? What will it look like? That is, I think, our duty of care as the elites or the people creating conversation. That's the conversation we should be having with youth.
Okay. Right. Martin Skold.
Thanks very much. Really interesting presentation. Funny story, actually. Back in my stint on the Hill, I actually worked for Paul Ryan at one point. So
Yeah.
I saw firsthand all of the problems with the deficit and tribalism, and the one hitting the other that you talk about.
Yep.
I do have a critique though that I was wondering if you might talk about. So I would very much locate myself kind of in the camp that you've described, where, you know, I care about the virus, I care about the person who can't put food on their table. I don't know what to do about any of that, and I hope somebody does. And I don't see anybody who's caught in that as the enemy. I'm also, as it happens, a fellow Hoya and Jesuit educated, so I know all about that. But
reason, yeah.
But look what I just did. I just said I'm located in a camp.
Yeah.
And I'm part of that identity.
Mm-hmm.
And these kind of talks always start with, let's solve the problems and puppies and kittens and rainbows. And they quickly turn into, let's throw the bums out of office. Sounds like the Tea Party. The mass media are the problem. I've heard that from Trump. Let's form a third party, which will be as embattled and as effectively tribal as anybody else.
100%.
Where's the outrage? Well, do we need more outrage? And then, the sort of idea of a hidden majority that are out there that aren't represented, which again sounds a little bit like Trump or a little bit like some demagogue. Weirdly enough, I don't even know if it's entirely borne out. There are Pew studies out there actually on polarization suggesting that while most Americans are independents, very few of them ever consider voting for the party that they voted for last time. And if it is the case that Twitter or Facebook are using algorithms to get us to start fights because they like drama, and believe it or not, we do too, only because we're bored in quarantine. And if it is the case that mass media like CNN, et cetera, love to create dramatic elections or big stories, if you can't entirely, get your name out there as a candidate without creating some sort of a narrative about how you're fighting for something, I would argue that we'll know we've succeeded when we stop being outraged, when we turn the television off, when we find better things to do than be on social media, when we don't share memes constantly that do the us versus them, when we learn to interact with people, which seems to be, as you noted, different from interacting with people on Facebook. It becomes less sloganeering, perhaps, and more human.
Martin, I tell you, you're speaking to, look, you're singing to the choir here, because it's not like I've got some magic Harry Potter wand that's going to make everything you just talked about go away. You've lived it up close. You've seen what happens on the Hill and how that works. And then if you go out and talk to citizens, you're right. You're part of that vast community that's saying, why is it so damn broken? But look, every one of your indictments of the current system are actually pieces of what we're working on. How do you tone down the social media? How do you change the psychology of outrage to one of problem solving? How do you, if all the institutions fail, what a surprise people are becoming tribal. Of course they're becoming tribal. They've always been tribal. And John Haidt's whole point was they've always been tribal. This isn't new. The question is that we used to have other things that bound us together in common cause, and that was a transcendent tribe. E pluribus unum, the things that, when there was World War II, we were bound together against a common enemy, right? But when you get a situation where the institutions begin to break down, the idea of the promise of the American dream that I bought into is not doing much for me. You've left me nowhere else to go but my tribe. And that is a deeper, more profound problem. And there is no, anybody who says there's a quick fix is full of it. There is no cheap silver bullet. And this came up on the call with that you guys hosted recently. There is no silver bullet. And we have a tendency to look for the instant gratification, quick silver bullet. Part of why Fix Us started was to get out of the trap of the short-term, quick fix, bumper sticker mentality and look at the deeper causes. So again, one of the asks we have for this group, the paper that we're working on, we would love to circulate that among people like yourself and get feedback. Tell us what we're missing. What isn't in it? What could we be doing better? How do we message this more effectively? What communities are we missing? Did we mischaracterize it? I welcome all the feedback we can get, because I ain't got no monopoly on this wisdom. Look, I'm a corporate guy who retired, who ended up being civically motivated because I watching the very thing that made my entire life success come apart. I can't stand it. I cannot sit back and watch that. Boris Pasternak, our sin is our toleration. How do you watch the greatest political experiment in history go down the tubes because we're all fighting like idiots? I just can't sleep at night knowing that that's acceptable. It's not.
Hey, Paul,
So yeah, there are a lot of problems we got to work on. Yeah.
we got a follow up from Richard.
Okay.
Are you willing, Richard? Aldous?
Oh yeah, sorry. I thought perhaps
Sure.
you were just going to put it from the chat. Yeah, it's just a very quick follow-up to what Martin just said.
Yeah.
I wonder, isn't always saying that everything is broken, kick the bums out, isn't that narrative part of the problem, not part of the
Yes.
solution?
Yes, I think it's a false narrative, and we've actually sold that as the answer. So people get saying, you've got agency, go throw the bums out. And yet, when you ask citizens, I'm telling you, I saw this, Richard, I saw this in little conference rooms all over this country. Well, we did throw them out, and how come it's the same damn thing? And how do you explain? You live in a place where you understand some of the inside baseball. I watched up close the inside baseball. I watched the grand bargain fall apart over stupidity. Utter stupidity and political calculus. I watched the cynicism of the AARP not wanting to talk about entitlements because it's more valuable to send postcards to grandma in Florida for political calculus, right?
Careful, careful.
Yeah, oops, sorry. Oh, sorry, yeah, sorry. Anyway, I watched, that broken thing happen. And when you begin to explain that to citizens out there in their various communities, it just blows their mind. They don't realize that when they say that quick fix, term limits, if I just threw them all out after 6 months, well, okay, if I ran my company on term limits, I take every good person and they'd automatically be gone in 6 or 8 years arbitrarily. Nobody wants to do, this is the cheap clarity that the Jesuits talk about. It's very seductive, but it's not durable and it's not real. So we keep looking for the cheap clarity, throw the bums out, do the term limits, just fix the gerrymandering, everything will be fine. Bullshit. It's just not true. It takes a deeper conversation. So I agree with you. Those are false narratives. And we've been offered that as, that's what passes for deep thinking. I don't buy it anymore.
Catherine.
Hello?
Catherine?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
Catherine, we can. Hi.
Okay, great. Thanks. So my question, I was wondering if you could maybe touch on some of the perverse incentives that are kind of baked into the system to where, everyone in DC wants to be powerful and influential. And usually the way that one does that is by tending towards the extreme. If you're the most conservative Republican out there, the Republicans will love you. Or if you're the most progressive Democrat, the Democrats will all love you. But if you try to play this, let's talk about what Americans are really thinking about, let's talk about the real issues that we all agree on, you're going to be in this kind of wishy-washy middle space, and those people don't become powerful, don't become influential, they kind of get washed under the rug.
100%.
And how do we kind of combat these incentives that are baked in that are driving us towards this polarized
So,
situation?
Catherine, absolutely 100% agree with you. And I have watched it up close, and it is just amazing to me to behold. But you're right. We have built a system of winners and losers, club against club, and winning at all costs far surpasses any motivation, to truly look at what I would call the common good. And I don't mean kumbaya, let's hold hands, everything's hunky-dory. I just mean the honest debate. And you get punished politically if you cross off the reservation and you violate the orthodoxy. And I watched that happen to Chuck Grassley on the ACA when Mitch McConnell just crucified him. I've watched it happen with numerous people who, quote, exercised moments of courage to do the right thing and just got eviscerated. I watched that happen to Kent Conrad by Harry Reid, who was trying to do the right thing on a budget deal. They just got crushed by a system where orthodoxy to the party, fealty to the party, orthodoxy was much more important. So, but citizens are not involved in that, right? And they don't control directly the kinds of money that get waged in this war. So they sit outside it and they just get frustrated. And you end up with Sam Gill's Project at Night Foundation, and you wonder why there are 100 million people who are not voting. Now, I've read the Pew statistics that somebody referenced earlier. I know a lot about the Pew statistics, but the 100 million people that Knight talked about is very interesting, because those are the 100 million people that, as a single voting block, if they did vote, would be bigger than any other single block. The other interesting thing about Pew, and they're not all just nuts living outside the system. They're people who are sick of the candidates, they don't like the system, but they're busy living their lives and they don't have the ability to change it. The other thing that Pew will tell you in their research about this division is that many people will self-identify now as unaffiliated. They may be registered with a party, but they identify as unaffiliated because there's an increasing decline in the adequacy or the efficacy of the party construct as they see it, and they don't resonate. And then you look at any of the resistance that's going on at a state level to any of the reforms that would do to weaken those parties' control of the extremes in those parties, those same people you're talking about, they're fighting it tooth and nail. Look at California, look at Florida, go to every one of those states. Who's against it? The party system, because they would much prefer to keep the system that you just gave an indictment of. So it's complicated. There are solutions. We are working with many of those people to begin to break into that. But it starts with educating our citizens about what's broken so that they don't feel that they just check out. They can actually engage and bring to bear pressure. That's my nonsense. Yep.
Last question, John Roush.
Uh-oh. We lost him.
John?
I hear.
Oh.
Yeah.
I had to stab 3 times at the unmute button. Well, I'm a good cleanup hitter, Paul, because I really just don't need a response. I just wanted to offer a word of praise and a word of encouragement. The word of praise is that I've been in and around political reform circles now since the late 80s and early 90s, and a repeated, I think, error has been epistemic, which is to project with far too much confidence that they know what's wrong and how to fix it. We saw that again and again with campaign finance. I think to some extent we're seeing it with ranked choice voting now. And I'm so happy that you're bringing an attitude of epistemic humility to this problem. And instead of telling us, you know how to fix it, it's got to be a multi-party system or RCV or gerrymandering or whatever the reform is for that day, you're taking a very different approach. Is the paper that you're referring to the one that whose outline Mike sent me today?
Yes.
Yeah, so that's really interesting because it's, I think, the first time in my life when I read something, a single document that tried to pull together all the stories about what's causing polarization and dysfunction. And it occurred to me looking through this, well, wait a minute, it's 2020 and no one else has ever done this. They've never just sat down and said, what are the theories about what's going on here and how do we categorize them and sort through them? So the attitude with which you're approaching this is one that I can only praise and wish we saw a lot more of. So thank you. The word of encouragement is that I'm a recent past member of the board of an organization called Braver Angels, used to be Better Angels. And it's one of a lot of organizations that are springing up at the grassroots level to try to address polarization and related problems in communities. There are tons of them. And that to me is very encouraging. We are, I think, starting to see a Tocquevillian bottom-up response. And the country looks better when you look at it from the bottom up than when you look at it from the top down. It's true of coronavirus and it's true of so much else. So those are efforts that I would point to as giving me hope and encouragement. So with all of that, thank you so much for spending an hour with us today.
Thank you.
Final word, Paul?
Well, look, I'll just reiterate with great humility. I'm an outlier in this group of people who are extremely accomplished thinkers, writers, participants in the system. I mean, I came to this just as a frustrated citizen, but boy, what a journey it's been. And I'll tell you one thing. Go spend, like I did, a couple of years traveling around this country talking to our fellow citizens. It is such an inspiring and amazing thing to do. It gives me such incredible hope. So it has not made me a cynic at all. It's made me incredibly positive about the extraordinary character and energy of this great nation. I'm almost becoming sappy about it, but it is an amazing thing. And they want their country back. They have been lost. They are homeless. They want to come home. And I think we all owe it in each of our own ways to reframe this narrative in a way that gives them a place to come home. And that's what I'm, what else am I going to do? Go back to business? I mean, that was fun. That was great. I was lucky. This is a lot more interesting to me, and I feel very grateful to have the opportunity to do it. And Craig, Charles, Jeff, all you guys, you're so generous to invite me to be part of this, amazing group. And thank you for the opportunity. Please come help us. We need your feedback. We need your engagement. We need your thoughts. We need your criticism. We need your critiques. We welcome it. We would love to have you part of it.
Great. Thank you so much. A great conversation as always. Let me just also say thank you, Charles and Jeff. It's terrific to have these kinds of evenings. It's really made lock down a little bit easier.